2019 was certainly a year where a few select games dominated the conversations in the gaming world. For myself, there's a special game in there that most of you may not have heard about. It's called Y2K, a postmodern RPG, and released way back in January. It has a t-shirt featured in Travis Strikes Again, got some pretty mediocre reviews, and then was generally forgotten about. Every few months, for some reason, Y2K would resurface in my social media feed. I'd hear some entertaining criticisms of the very strange plot decisions that were made. Eventually, those would turn into wild accusations of a more serious nature, some involving plagiarism, some involving allegations of racism and sexism. To some people, the main character of Y2K is considered an utterly despicable individual. Each time these complaints resurfaced, they seemed to be directed less at the game and more so the small team of individuals who made it, not just going after their body of work, but also going after remarks they made in various interviews. Even games that featured characters from Y2K in cameo roles have been subjected to intense criticism, and in some cases targeted by some sort of harassment campaign. And yet, Y2K is a game that went generally ignored by the mainstream. In order to learn what was happening with this game, I'd have to delve into some pretty shady parts of the internet to hear people's takes. Even then, I was rarely satisfied. By the end of 2019, I decided that I had to independently investigate what this game was for myself. What followed is one of the strangest experiences I've ever had playing a video game. I actually spent New Year's Eve beating a game that ends exactly 20 years earlier. And it wasn't just because of that synchronicity that made it strange, nor was it because of what was actually in the game. It's because of everything that surrounds Y2K, especially how those accusations look in light of actually playing the game for myself. I'm not sure how much this is going to resemble a typical review. I'll share as much as I can about the experience, but I also feel some need to give my own thoughts on the various controversies that have dogged this game, and whether or not they deserve to even be called controversies at all. So if you'll stick with me, I'd be happy to show you what Y2K, a postmodern RPG, really is made of. Y2K is, by its own admission, a postmodern RPG made by a small company known as Ackk Studios, published by YIIK. The majority of the game was designed by brothers Brian and Andrew Allanson, with Brian credited with programming and character design, while Andrew handled the writing and music. The game bills itself as a supernatural Japanese-style role-playing game with action-based microgames for combat, and that's pretty accurate. Imagine if you took Earthbound, Persona 4, and the Mario RPGs and put them into a blender with a few other things. Actually, the game does contain a list of the various properties that inspired it. But if we look at the story and tone of Y2K, we see that the sources of inspiration are a bit less well known. Seeing the word postmodern in the title might come across as pretentious to some. I initially thought that it was a play on words, given that the game takes place around the turn of the new millennium. But the developers have been pretty open about using various postmodern authors as their primary influences. Writers like Haruki Murakami, David Foster Wallace, and Thomas Pynchon are among those who have been cited, and while I'm by no means an expert in their works, I do know that they can be very divisive. I could attempt to give you a comprehensive breakdown of postmodernism as art, but then we would be here all day. All you really need to know is that the story of Y2K is not exactly told in a traditional manner. But then again, if you were looking to buy an indie RPG, you probably assume that much. So with the introduction out of the way, we'll begin my synopsis of the game itself. Then we'll move on to the analysis and the controversies that surrounded Y2K, and my personal feelings on those matters. Timestamps will be included in the description, and of course, be prepared for significant spoilers. This video is meant to function as a watchable tour of the game, because it's necessary to understand what Y2K actually is before we can properly analyze it. At the beginning, we're greeted by the most 90s menu ever. A crow named Marlene asks us some questions about who we are and the people in our life. If you've played Earthbound, you might know where this is going. Still, I highly recommend being truthful during this portion for the best possible payoff later. The game starts off in Frankton, New Jersey. Immediately, we're introduced to our protagonist, Alex, just as he's returning from graduating college. He makes his way home and finds a list of chores from his mother before receiving a strange phone call.
The needle of the record player has dropped. The sound of the world around us will change the nature of all realities, both yours and mine.
What?
On his way to the grocery store, Kat steals the list and he chases it to an abandoned hotel where strange figures can be seen outside. It doesn't take long after getting inside that things start to become surreal. Alex even finds a giant talking panda who was apparently his childhood friend. Then there's a puzzle room with the Illuminati pyramid and an eerie female entity that speaks only in nonsensical quotes. Before long, Alex meets a woman named Sammy who apparently owns the cat. Not much of what she says makes much sense. She acts like this place is her home and that nothing seems out of the ordinary.
I've been pretty lonely here.
Where is here, anyway?
I was hoping you'd know. I've been lost down here forever.
Did you come through the elevator, too?
Elevator? I don't know what that is.
Together, the two solve some puzzles and fight more monsters before ending up in an elevator together.
Where do you live? I'll walk you back home, or maybe I can borrow my mom's car and drive you if it's outside of Frankton.
What do you mean? This is my home. This is where I live.
What? You live in this shithole?
Before Alex can get any answers about just who Sammy is, cosmic beings break into the elevator and snatch her away.
Please don't! Alex, don't let them take me, please!
He escapes the hotel and runs home in the night, only to find that he's received an email that links to a strange website. On this website is a video containing security footage from the elevator where Sammy was taken, except Alex isn't present. The next afternoon, Alex decides to head back and look for Sammy with Panda's encouragement. Then it abruptly cuts to a sequence where a female narrator describes what we're seeing. The hooded figures from outside of the hotel are crowded around some sort of synthetic woman in bed. I think this is all supposed to be a dream that Alex was having, but for some reason, we see this after he's gotten out of bed.
Her face is lined with the most profound solemnance. We confer with each other and come to an agreement.
Okay, so let's review.
So let's take a break from just relaying the story to explain a bit about how it's told. One of the game's biggest criticisms is Alex's narration. He spends quite a bit of time letting us know how he feels about all of the events going on. This isn't inherently bad, but even just in this introductory sequence, they can really drag things out, and many of the observations just seem inappropriate.
I picture what it would be like to be the owner, and I imagine describing him to a friend. Lonely? Nah, I don't get too lonely. Besides my mom, there's only a cat. An old cat. But a good friend to talk to. My fictional friend would reply, "You talk things over, do you?" I'd nod. Uh-huh. Been together a long time, so we can read each other's moods.
The biggest offender thus far is when Alex receives the email. This isn't long after he's just witnessed a horrifying event, and then he's rambling about pornography.
I thought of all the things it could be. More animal porn, human porn, cartoon porn. You could never really guess with this guy. But it was most certainly going to be pornographic. Maybe a girl from my high school was now into adult videos and...
It's just not at all congruent with the rest of the tone, and makes it unnecessarily hard to relate with him. The best thing I can say about this is that the narration does improve over the course of the game. It does become more relevant and somewhat concise over time, but it's going to be a long time until we get there. It wouldn't be quite as bad if most of it played in the background during gameplay, but that is extremely rare. One thing I can commend at this stage, however, is the art direction. It's not going to be to everyone's taste, but I quite like it. Ackk Studios managed to take something that's clearly inspired by retro RPGs, but using 3D graphics instead of the usual pixel art. It's only a matter of time before we start to see more indie games trying to emulate the look of early 3D titles, and Y2K demonstrates that this might not be such a bad concept. The use of flat colors and simple lighting really shines in the game's more surreal environments, allowing any additional effects to carry a lot more weight than they might have otherwise. Character models also look somewhat intentionally deformed as well, and that works for me. They definitely look like some of the janky sprites that you might see for the townspeople in an old Pokemon game or something. And the main cast all have easily identifiable looks, even if 3 of them are wearing striped red shirts. That might have been a little much. Even the 2D art manages to find a nice middle ground between stylization and realism, and each character does have a variety of expressions, even if they do sometimes remind me of a YouTube persona. Either way, let's get back to things. On his way back to the hotel, Alex bumps into Michael, an old friend from before high school. It seems that Michael is one of the moderators on the forum where the elevator footage was posted. Alex tells him that he knows the place where the footage was recorded, and Michael decides that they should head there and take pictures for the site. They hang out in town for a little bit before heading out to the hotel to investigate. When they ride up the elevator where Sammy was taken, they end up in a chamber where the cosmic entity resides. There's no way to hurt this thing, so all that they can do is run away after taking some pictures. When they get back home and upload the photos to the forum, Alex admits to Michael that he actually met Sammy in the hotel before she was taken by the creatures. Even after explaining everything online, the new images just raise more questions than answers, and no new information surfaces for weeks. That's when they find a post showing a woman opening holes in reality. A woman that Alex and Michael saw working at the local arcade.
Just man up and say something to her.
I don't think I should. It'd be, good for you to learn to talk to girls before you go away to college.
I know how to talk to girls, but she is a senior citizen, man. What is she, like, 27? Ew.
She promptly kicks their asses. But she's still curious about the photos because they are authentic. She introduces herself as Vella and claims that she has the power to control sound waves with her keytar, a skill that she learned in something called the Mind Dungeon. She's also interacted with the entities before, but refuses to elaborate. So after grinding and leveling up, the gang gets a private message from an ONISM user claiming that his sister disappeared in a manner similar to Sammy. So together with Vella, they get on a bus to his town. There's a cutscene where Vella confirms that there is a real Sammy Park who went missing locally, and Alex doubts that it may be the same person. But I was a little distracted during most of this cutscene because his voice actor appears to inexplicably change in the middle of it.
Legal cleric and hadn't even begun working yet when she vanished. Apparently, the organization she was going to work for does a public TV Korean news show.
Where exactly did you find out all this?
I read about it in a Korean newspaper.
Are you Korean?
No. Do I look Korean?
It's hard to say. You look vaguely ethnic?
Really?
So then we arrive at Windtown, which has a sad atmosphere, really the total opposite of Frankton. Rory Manser is the contact we're looking for. He claims that his sister disappeared several weeks ago, and her belongings were found at the scenes of various fatal accidents in town. That night, he takes us to the sewers where one of these incidents happened, while also admitting that he can still feel his sister's presence in the area. Despite the reputation that sewer levels have, this area isn't very complex. It's mostly a straight shot through tunnels, though you will have to fight the Ninja Turtles if you want to get the keys you need. There's very little in the way of puzzles here. You turn off some water here, but that's pretty much it. The two new items that you get here basically serve the same purpose, and really should have just been combined into one. After getting to the end of the sewers, Rory leads the group towards another entity, which he claims is his sister.
Rory, that isn't your sister. It's...
Shut up! That's Terry! Can't you feel it? It's so familiar. I can prove it.
Vella calmly explains that these entities, also called soul survivors, are the souls of people from other dimensions. This one is actually Rory from another dimension who rejected his physical form to come here, not his sister, who he now admits had committed suicide.
Rory, please! I'm here to help you. Did your sister really vanish?
No, she jumped off the overpass.
Rory, that's terrible.
But then a golden alpaca shows up, and now we have to fight it.
Okay, what the hell was that thing?
Vella explains that she knows how all this multiverse stuff works because she herself is an interdimensional being, but did not become a soul survivor because the Vella of this dimension had already left it. The game then cuts back to the strange synthetic woman in her bed for a bit. Then it cuts back to Alex in his bed. It's now been 8 days since the sewer incident, and he's not sure about any of the things he's been told, although he's still motivated to find Sammy. Then the game cuts back to the sewers, where we actually have to leave the dungeon, but then things get even trippier. The sewer turns into an abstract space. Several soul survivors are gathered here, talking about their god. We go through one last door and end up outside of the sewers where no one acknowledges any of the stuff that we just saw. Alex gets really pissed and confused by this turn of events, but takes things a bit too far in the process, insulting Rory despite his obvious trauma.
My 12-year-old sister killed herself. She died right here. Right where we're standing.
Hey, dude, cool it with that! No one cares about your sister right now. We almost just died ourselves!
Things then cut to what I have to assume is the inside of Alex's mind. These hooded figures here all have his face, and they criticize him for his anger.
The Alex I know would have never acted this way. Seriously, just stop being such a loser. I think Vella thinks you're a stuck-up rich kid who's never known real-world problems in his life.
But when it finally cuts back to reality, he's not any less angry.
How do you expect me to remain calm with all this crazy shit going on around us? Just because you're cool with soul survivors and astral projection or whatever the hell you've been on about, doesn't mean everyone else is!
Alex! Shut up! Stop it! This isn't all about you, you know!
Then we finally cut back to Alex at home, where his mom has finally come home from work, but she has bad news. She was laid off, and Alex needs to go look for a job. So then we go back into his head again to work out the problems.
Alex, take a step back. Our mom works really hard. It's not her fault you need to get a job.
Now that we have a full party, it's a great time to discuss the game's combat mechanics in detail. It's quite easy to compare it to games like the Mario RPGs and Undertale. Basic attacks take the form of quick time event-esque sequences, while special moves play out more like retro minigames. Enemy attacks involve precise timing as well, with the best timing usually allowing you to avoid damage altogether. If you're having trouble with the timing, you could always use your time energy to slow things down a bit, though it does take some time to recover. The biggest problems with Y2K's combat are deeply connected. First, there's the fact that battles can feel a little longer than they should be. Some of these QuickTime events can really add up over the course of a fight. In something like Mario and Luigi, a basic attack can be done in just a couple of seconds. But some of the basic attacks in Y2K will take much longer to execute if you're trying to rack up damage, and this isn't even counting the animations for the attack, which will take a few more seconds and occasionally hitch for no clear reason. Enemy attacks also suffer from this issue. If a foe's attack can target multiple party members, then each party member needs to dodge the attack individually. If you get into a situation where every enemy uses this attack, then you could be doing the dodge minigame a dozen or more times in a row on just one turn. Next, there's a glaring lack of consistency when it comes to how attacks will land. From beginning to end, I could never gauge how much damage my attacks would actually do. It's virtually impossible to get feedback from your hits. Whatever formulas determine your damage output don't seem to be working properly. Anything that hits multiple times will cause these blue numbers to appear above the target, but the values themselves don't actually mean anything. They don't add up to the total amount of damage dealt. Then there's the fact that the text menus will often scroll by at lightning speed, making it impossible to read them. Given the gimmicky nature of some special moves, you might not know what they're even doing when you use them. So let's go over the movesets a bit. Alex, being the main character, has some of the most useful moves in the game. His basic attack involves pressing the button on the colored portions of a record to increase your total hits. Hitting the red bar will extend your spin for an extra rotation. When you first start using this attack, you might not find it very impressive, but the true power comes from the fact that you can score multiple hits on the same strip. If you use some time energy, you can easily rack up a combo of 15 or more, far more than any other character in this game. His special abilities are well-rounded. Panda Barrier straight up negates all damage from the next 3 attacks to the entire party. EP Strike does a lot of damage to one target, although it feels a bit redundant compared to his basic attack, not to mention it doesn't do as much damage as LP Toss. LP Toss is easily the greatest move in the game. You can hit every enemy with it and score insane combos depending on how well you can stun lock the enemies in the minigame. It can easily insta-kill most enemies, ending fights just as fast as they started. There's not much consistency when it comes to how it selects targets though. Sometimes the damage will only be spread over some of the enemies, where regardless of how many you manage to hit in the minigame. Otherwise, it'll say that you missed in a text box, but it still applies the damage anyway. There's no way this attack is functioning properly. The stronger Alex gets, the more it just becomes a nuclear bomb that cuts through any strategy whatsoever. Michael and Vella's moves don't really compare to what Alex can do damage-wise, and don't have a whole lot of practical uses. Creative minigames aren't worth playing when the moves they're attached to aren't that great. Then there's Rory. Rory sucks. He can't fight at all for some reason, but he can take hits for allies and try to debuff enemies, which doesn't work very consistently. Honestly, I ditched him as soon as I could. His pacifism might make some sense if he could heal his friends, but he can't. He does have a move that has a chance to make an enemy just leave, but it fails frequently and costs way too many points to make it worthwhile. Y2K attempts to put a spin on leveling up by making it all take place in a metaphysical space called the Mind Dungeon. You can access this from any phone. It's run by that crow named Marlene that you might remember from the intro.
Excuse me.
Leveling up requires approaching a door, selecting which stat you want to increase, selecting the door again to enter it so that you actually get the stat increase, and then doing the same for all of the other doors before talking to Marlene and heading to the next floor to start the process all over again. What takes seconds to do in most RPGs can take several minutes here, with constant mashing through the same text boxes over and over again. When you head here, you'll probably have enough saved XP to level up several times, so all of this can really add up. Sure, you can just ask Marlene to automatically set Alex's stats for you, but you'll still have to do this for every individual level, and I'd much rather try to build him out the way I want. The creativity of a system like this is seriously brought down by a combination of tedium and missed potential. The second problem here is a complete lack of purpose. Marlene hints that there's a secret waiting for us in the Mind Dungeon. As you go through it, he'll talk to you in the form of various puppets. But eventually these little skits just stop happening. No explanation, no purpose, it never ties into the story in any meaningful way, and it feels more like an underdeveloped plot thread than anything else. Meanwhile, Alex looks around town for a job, but no dice. That night, he realizes that a sole survivor has been living in his house since he first arrived. He chases it through his backyard and ends up at an abandoned radio tower where he finds the jacket for a record called Mystical Ultima Legend, which he believes the entity wants him to broadcast. The next morning he decides he wants to go on a quest to find the record, but Vella gives him a harsh reality check when trying to dissuade him.
When you finally get a job, you'll understand how everything can't be conspiracies and missing mysterious girls all the time. Alex, calm down.
No, it's fine! I'm everyone's punching bag! It's totally great, just keep kicking me.
Get over yourself, Alex. Could you be any more of an entitled little brat?
He heads to Windtown with Michael to look for the record, but also to apologize to Rory. The player has the option of demanding Rory apologize for lying about his sister instead, but he'll still accompany you regardless. The boys hang out a bit between checking stores. Rory talks about the state of the world and brings up the looming Y2K crisis.
When 2000 rolls around, all the computers will crash and nuclear bombs will go off or something.
Is this real? Like, is this really going to happen?
Probably. I don't know. I think I'd kind of like to see it happen.
After checking 4 different stores, they end up in Flagtown, where the store's owner, Claudio, immediately pegs Alex for an ONISM user.
Somebody posted a photo of this record jacket, and they've been asking people if they have a copy. They said it had something to do with Semi Park's disappearance.
How do you know about Semi?
I go on the forum too, obviously.
He doesn't have the record either, but he knows a collector who lives in the nearby mountain town. Together with his sister Chandra, the two join the party. Mountain Town is filled with Ghostbusters who've read reports that there's a female ghost haunting the caves. This brings us to the third dungeon, which is much less linear and more dynamic than the others thus far. There's a few different directions you could head in, as well as some large puzzle areas that make good use of Dolly the cat. I also enjoy the blue color palette and the soft music. I don't particularly enjoy wading through poison to collect key items though, especially when the poison effect is not very good on the eyes. Unfortunately for Alex, the ghost turns out not to be Sammy. It's just some other girl who sings the songs off of her haunted mixtape. You can give this tape to either her brother or her unfaithful boyfriend, but it doesn't have any real effect on the story. So after that little adventure, the group finally meets the record collector, Mark. He tells some weird anecdotes before doing something that none of the other characters have actually bothered to do.
The Mystical Ultima LP Legend by Vella Wild.
Did you say Vella Wild?
Yeah. But didn't you know this already? It's on the cover. Did you even read it?
This makes the entire party look like utter idiots, but thankfully they have a new lead. Find the album inside Vella's mind dungeon. After their talk with Mark, Claudio tells Alex about how his brother disappeared when he was young. Together with Chandra, they give him a dose of reality regarding what it's like to have a missing family member, and suggest that missing white women syndrome is why Sammy's disappearance may not have made the headlines, rather than any sort of strange conspiracy.
Alex, don't you think Sammy's parents tried to get some attention for their daughter's disappearance? It's not that easy. Those people you see on TV are people who can make a great story for the press. That's just the way it works.
I don't think I ever gave it any thought.
Yeah, man. That's just how they get away with it. People like you don't think about it. And people like us, it's all we ever get to think about.
Chandra tells Alex privately that Claudio has never gotten over their brother's disappearance, and that she fears that Sammy will just become an obsession for both of them.
I don't think he'll ever move on. It's all he thinks about. And finding this Sammy Pat girl, this obsession you brought onto him, this shit isn't fair. He had one dead kid to worry about never finding, and now you gave him another.
We've picked up 2 more party members at once, so let's go over them very briefly. Claudio has big weeaboo energy, but with only one special move in the game, he's too boring to use. Even though time energy would be much more useful here than for other special attacks, you just can't use it for some reason. Chandra is extremely technical, but she doesn't do enough damage to justify it. I'm not sacrificing a party member's life just to try and use an attack that I could still miss. Even then, it's not going to be as strong as Alex's damage output. This is really the point where combat starts to break down in a different way. Alex becomes the only person who can do serious damage against enemies that have a lot of health. No one else can rack up as much damage with their basic attacks, nor can they use a skill that does as much damage as LP Toss. To make matters worse, we've learned every skill in the game by just level 20, and you're probably going to get to level 40 or 50 by the end. The joy of discovering new techniques has dried up much earlier than it should have. Y2K is a weird game. Of that, there's no doubt. And if there's one thing that a weird game needs to have to build atmosphere, it's weird music. And thankfully, Andrew Allanson came through on this front. The greatest strength of Y2K's music is also its greatest weakness. It's all over the place. You've got songs that incorporate live instruments, vocalists, and chiptunes from all sorts of game eras. Not to mention a large list of collaborators from composers who've worked on both indie games and AAA projects. The sheer range of music really helps because I can see some of these tracks getting very annoying if you heard them for way too long, so it's good to have as many different battle tracks as we've got. The way in which the various leitmotifs were repurposed for tracks is very creative and something that took a surprising amount of time for me to pick up on. I'm not going to say that Y2K has one of the greatest soundtracks I've heard in recent years, but it's been a long time since I heard a soundtrack that was as catchy as this one. I couldn't get it out of my head for months after beating the game. Of course, there are a couple songs that are too strange for their own good in my opinion. They might overpower certain sequences or come off as totally out of place. Not to mention that there's 1 or 2 that sound like they're biting a little too hard from Earthbound, but those are few and far between. It's funny, Toby Fox has a song in here, but I don't find it nearly as interesting or catchy as some of the others, because it's honestly a little too conventional compared to them. Ultimately, you be the judge of the music. You're likely hearing a lot of it in the background of this video. Y2K was in development for a very long time. This is not horribly uncommon for a game with such a small team, but it also suggests that the game itself may have changed a lot throughout production. You can easily confirm this if you search for footage of the various preview builds that were taken to events such as PAX, PlayStation Experience, and other shows. We're going to focus on 2 of these builds that were specifically labeled as episodes, as Ackk Studios decided to do something a bit strange for these, make completely unique scenarios to avoid spoiling anything in the final game. The first of these is called Episode Prime, originally made as a PAX West demo in 2016, but also released online. Episode Prime starts with a disclaimer stating that because it's entirely new content, there is no voice acting outside of combat, but after the first 5 minutes, it should look immediately familiar, because it's just the cave dungeon from the final game, mostly unchanged. This explains why this portion of the game felt like filler to me. It basically is. It's the Garlic Jr. saga of Y2K. All that's really changed is that Vella has been replaced by Rory in the cutscenes. I thought it was strange that some of the scenes here did not have voice acting, and now I understand why. They were all written after the voice work had been finished. Even though it could be called filler, I don't mind the inclusion of this dungeon, as it is a very solid one to play through. And it also helps breaking up the monotony of this chapter, because so far, it's mostly just been dialogue scenes and traveling across the overworld. So what about the other demo? It's called Cape Juno and debuted at PAX East 2018, just a year before the release date. It was never released publicly, but it can be accessed through some debug commands. Unlike Prime, which slides effortlessly into the story, Juno was clearly made as a non sequitur demo, and nothing more. Still, I'm shocked by how much work seems to have gone into it. There's a unique town, unique NPCs, unique music. It's honestly surprising, but not as surprising as the fact that none of this is in the game, although once you see the content, you'll understand why. Alex is all alone on this quest. The only party member he gets is a man named Wilfred, who functions identically to Claudio when in combat. Wilfred made a post on ONISM saying that his dead fiance's pregnant mother has gone missing. After helping out a mermaid, we find the mother with a weird alien baby that Wilfred wants to kill, we fight the baby daddy for a minute, and then Wilfred yeets off with the baby. The end. There isn't much to say about this demo on its own, but it does make me think of what the game could have been. Each chapter could have been an episodic Monster of the Week type adventure, with Sammy and Y2K serving as looming mysteries to be resolved by the end. The final project flirts with this idea, but it's about to abandon it as soon as we complete this next dungeon. Everyone heads back to the Frankton arcade, where Alex and Vella make up with each other. Then they head into her mine dungeon, where they meet the girl from Valhalla and bring the band back together. This place makes the first 2 dungeons seem like tutorial areas. The goal is to find 4 Vellas that are scattered around the place. There's not exactly a fixed order to this, which means that the dungeon is wide open. That also means you could get lost pretty easily. Still, I think the odd visuals you'll come across here fit better than they did in the sewers. They also offer some good insight into Vella as a person, and you can watch Sammy put some batteries into her soup. If this dungeon's missing anything to me, it's some kind of boss battle. I'm not saying that we need to go full Persona and have Shadow Vella, but this is the second dungeon in a row without a boss, and it feels a little strange. After playing the record in Alex's room, Vella runs off to the park. Somehow it's become the Halloween season after stepping outside. Anyway, Alex listens to her explanation of how the record exists. In her home universe, Vella was a musical prodigy who met an older musician. They created the album together and became romantically involved, but things fell apart when he abandoned her after his family found out. The next time she saw him, he was with an even younger woman. In her depression, she left her body and entered the soul space, arriving to this dimension to find its version of the man that she'd fallen in love with. The game gives you the choice to try and kiss Vella here. I only did this because I was recording for all of you. Playing the record on the radio causes Alex to have a vision. The synthetic woman finally awakens and kills some entities with her Buster Sword. He decides that he needs to find the van where this android is being kept. Rory wants to have a talk with Alex outside of the tower. It's optional, but allows the two to patch things up if they were rough earlier, and lets Rory air out some of the things that stress him in life. Also, we can try to kiss him, which I only did because I was recording.
Hey, no. Yeah, don't do that again.
That night, Alex has a dream where he feels a deep romantic connection to what he thinks might be the android. Rory comes through on ONISM by compiling a thread for sightings of the van, which apparently has been seen in some security footage with Sammy. After tracking it down by the mall, the gang fights another entity before Alex finds himself sucked into the void.
Hello, Alex. My favorite soul. I must thank you for coming to retrieve me.
The android reveals herself to Alex as the Essentia 2000, a life form capable of existing in all dimensions at once while still maintaining an understanding of its identity within each dimension. It claims to possess the soul of both Sammy Park and Vella, as well as many others whose combined work resulted in its creation. She explains that Sammy had already started transitioning from her dimension to the soul space when she met Alex. The entities that took her from the elevator were actually just fragments of her soul. In a sense, she was committing some form of soul suicide.
I had to wait until Sammy, this reality's version of me, died or escaped into the soul space. Upon her voyage into the void, I entered, and I followed you home. I lived with you for weeks as I gained my strength.
Then the Essentia takes Alex through her own mind dungeon. But let's take a detour to talk about the joy of solving puzzles. Alex's pal Panda is the only tool in the game that serves a purpose both in combat and out of it, and he's one of the most versatile puzzle tools that you'll get, able to press down switches and serve as a platform or a barrier. Sadly, he's a bit underutilized given how creative some of these applications end up being. Sammy's cat Dolly is similarly practical, able to hit levers, open chests, and stun enemies at a distance. By default, this is probably the tool that you're going to want to have equipped. The skateboard is useful for getting around quickly and clearing certain gaps, but just keep in mind that you can't course correct once you start riding. The other tools in the game just don't add much value. The amp is used to break some rocks, the hair whip cuts down certain trees, and the flamethrower melts these large candles. They're all a bit too similar in function. Only the amp stands out because some of its interactables are at least concealed in the environment, and the flamethrower might as well only have been used to make light sources. There are a few odd instances where the game breaks its own rules though. In this instance, the player has to press down 3 switches, so I stand here and put Panda down here, but what about the third switch? Apparently the solution is to send Dolly to touch it, even though he zooms back after a second. It's just not how the other puzzles have worked, but it's the solution. Before we get back to things, I have to answer a very important question that you've probably been wondering. What is that on Alex's shirt? Who is that character? Is that the name of the game studio? Yes. Yes it is. Before developing Y2K, Ackk Studios made their first retail game, Two Brothers. In 2012, it was put on Kickstarter late in its development where it generated $16,000 in pledges. The game was billed as an action RPG created in the style of old Game Boy artwork. Most of the environments mimicked the grayscale color palette, but dying caused you to enter the afterlife where vibrant colors await. Two Brothers came out in late 2013 on PC, with various ports to follow. What few reviews there are not that great, mainly citing technical issues as the primary problems. Since you've likely never heard of this game, one can assume that it was not very successful or recognized. The planned ports for the game never came out. By 2014, Ackk was making preparations to rebrand and relaunch the game as part of their efforts to improve it. Two Brothers was to receive a director's cut under a new title, Chromophore. This is the version of the game that would be released on consoles, with Nintendo even hosting a trailer for the game online. At least that's what was supposed to happen. Chromophore was never released. Not only that, but Two Brothers also has been delisted from Steam. I seriously considered playing it for this video, but there's no way for me to do that at the present time. From what I can gather, Chromophore was put on the back burner once the Allanson brothers were able to secure funding for Y2K. The new project simply took priority, and the longer Y2K took to finish, the less demand anyone would have for an updated version of Two Brothers. The most bizarre part is that Ackk has still maintained that Chromophore will be finished eventually. I'm not even sure if I believe this though, it might be some kind of sick joke. Either way, Ackk just couldn't resist putting lots of references to Two Brothers and themselves into Y2K. It's a little ridiculous and inappropriate at times. I think even Hideo Kojima might cringe at some of these.
Ever play Two Brothers? That's a sort of ARPG, although its focus really isn't on combat.
Two Brothers? Nope. That's a terrible name for a game, though.
As I listen to the soaring strings and strangely syncopated bass line of Symphony 7 in E-flat by Andrew Allanson.
Two Brothers will become a bit more relevant later on, but this is pretty much what you need to know about it for now. Here's to hoping it does become playable at some point in the future, though. In this dungeon, we only have Alex and the Essentia 2000. Thankfully, this isn't going to be a problem because LP Toss should now be doing hundreds of points of damage, insta-killing everything. We won't even have to use the Essentia most of the time. That's not to say that she isn't appealing as a damage dealer, because her basic attack can hit hard and none of her special moves require any minigames to work. But everything she does comes at the cost of health, and she can only regain it through skipping turns or using unique healing items. Essentia's dungeon contains many of the other lives that she experienced. Many of them seem to have undergone some sort of tragedy that led to them either developing the Essentia or leaving their home for the soul space. The atmosphere here is pretty unnerving thanks to some good ambient music and a variety of strange visual effects, not to mention some genuinely gross imagery. I think the fact that the models aren't very detailed really helps make some things seem more suggestively disgusting. The game's most challenging puzzles are in this dungeon, ranging from following ghostly footsteps to scrolling through repeating rooms, and these two massive puzzle chambers that are actually a lot more straightforward than they might seem. Eventually, Alex comes across a Japanese military officer, presumably another one of Essentia's parallel lives. He claims that Alex has killed him over the span of 50 lifetimes. He calls Alex a thief who's taken everything away from him. Essentia claims that she can't remember Yuzu's life, even as he refers to her as his mother. Before long, they get into a fight. This fight is notable because it contains a unique QuickTime event, which I don't think happens anywhere else. It doesn't matter because we can use LP Toss to kill him instantly.
That wasn't even my final form! LP? Oh!
Essentia takes Alex to a secret chamber in his mind dungeon, where all of his parallel lives are playing out. At the end of the hall is a room that shows the fate he shares across all of them. Alex is the destroyer. He will destroy reality, whether he wants to or not. It's happened countless times before, and it will happen again. The Essentia claims that the only thing he can do to help is to convince as many people as possible to enter soul space before the apocalypse comes to pass.
Why is this my choice?
Because this is your reality, not mine. I just want you to be happy.
Essentia also begins to express the unconditional love that Alex dreamt of. She claims that he has harmed her in every reality. This means that a parallel counterpart Alex was the older man who emotionally manipulated and abused Vella. Alex is horrified and wants to stay and try to prevent the end times. The party must work together and try to get as strong as possible before reality is destroyed, which will happen on New Year's Eve, 1999. After leaving the mind dungeon, Alex realizes he's been gone for almost a week. When he gives Vella a call, things take a dark turn.
Alex, didn't you hear?
Hear what? What's wrong?
2 nights ago, Rory committed suicide.
What? Why the hell would he kill himself?
He was hurting from losing his sister still. Oh, shit. I wish there was something more we could have done.
I wanted to tell Vella he reached out to me. I wanted to tell her I had been cruel. I had been so selfish. And then I was selfish again. I didn't tell Vella anything. I told her I was sorry. I cried with her. I did my best to not let her know I felt guilty. Why? Because I wanted her to like me. I needed everyone to like me. I needed to be a solid guy in everyone's book. No. I just needed to seem like a good person to myself. And I needed to change that.
After this, Alex meets up with his friends and convinces them to help him fix the Y2K problem. But Michael is nowhere to be found, not until he calls Alex's home several days later. He's in a forest meadow nearby where he appears to have ascended to a higher plane. Michael entered his own mind dungeon and has fused with all of his parallel lives. This has caused him to realize how the fabric of reality is deteriorating as a result of the impending apocalypse. He knows that Alex has destroyed realities, but never tried to stop him until now.
Do you realize how many times we've had this conversation? It's like clockwork. I have a friend. This friend continuously hurts another friend of ours. And soon he realizes his flaws. He soon asks me to try and save him from self-destruction. Every time I say no, and every time you destroy our reality. Maybe it took for me to realize what not helping a friend can do to that friend. But I'm in. Let's win this thing.
We then get to spend the next month hanging out and doing side quests in the game world, all in order to make sure that we can get as strong as we need to be for Y2K. This is where the game attempts to go full Persona and falls flat. We have over a month to train in the Mine Dungeon, but this objective that the game gives you is totally wrong. The Mine Dungeon is just where you go to cash your XP in, and that has not changed. Going inside is a waste of a day if you don't have enough XP to level up. Instead, you'll want to hang out with your friends, which will grant you a complete level up. But you can only do this for a few days before you actually have to go outside. You could just clear out the monster dens if you want to, but now there's a plethora of side quests on ONISM that will give you lots of XP and some of the best weapons in the game. You can also kiss Essentia during one of the hangouts, but I'm not showing you. Go buy the game for that. Even if you handle all of these, there's still far too many days left on this calendar. It's going to look normal to just skip days completely, which is the last thing you want to be doing in any life simulator. Had the game provided more side quests than it does, then there might have been a reason for so much extra time. But even if it did, there would still be a serious issue with this part, and I can't explain why quite yet. In the early morning of New Year's Eve, Alex starts getting more strange phone calls than he's ever gotten before. Some of these calls are from Sammy, others are from his friends, some even appear to be from Claudio and Chandra's parents. Alex talks to Panda some more and starts to realize for himself just how many aspects of his life seem to have radically changed over the months without him even realizing it.
When do you think it started?
Well, I guess around the time I came home from school, for starters. And I know this could be just a coincidence, but I didn't see my mom for weeks. Where's my dad been? Don't you remember? My dad worked for Pacific Chime. Not my mom. When did my mom start working for Pacific Chime?
You don't have a dad.
Yeah, I do. Of course I do. Everyone has a dad.
Then where is he?
And then Michael. When did Michael move back to Frankton?
Didn't Michael move away when he was 10?
When did he move away?
By the time morning comes, Alex's father is sitting on the couch, not making much sense. It still looks pitch black outside, so let's go through the front door. But before that, I should specify, because I haven't exactly made this clear, Rory's suicide is an entirely avoidable event. In fact, despite lots of people citing it as a major issue with the game's story, I highly doubt that most people who've gotten to this point in Y2K experience this outcome intentionally. Dialogue choices in Y2K are very rare, but most of them are related to interactions with Rory. You can apologize to him after the sewer incident, or take the opportunity to make him feel worse about lying to you in the first place. When he asks to talk at the radio, you can straight up refuse to do so. Obviously, there's the kissing part as well. As far as I can tell, the game just wants you to acknowledge Rory more than anything else. Not apologizing to him, or attempting to kiss him, isn't enough to cause him to take his life. But refusing to talk to him at all, and then straight up forgetting to go to Windtown to get him during the search of the van, would be. I had hoped to test things out more thoroughly, but unfortunately I experienced a bug that prevented me from picking up Rory. The prompt just never worked for me, despite many attempts to fix the issue. So unfortunately, I don't have any footage of Rory surviving, which is what happened the first time I played the game off camera. Equally unfortunately, I can tell you that Rory's survival, or his suicide, depending on how you look at it, has very little impact on the rest of the game. We've already established that he stinks in combat, but he also has very few lines of dialogue from here on out. In fact, some of the cutscenes that he did have lines in can actually start to break because of his absence.
Something is weird here! It's like strange things are happening all around us, and only I'm actually noticing it!
It's all very frustrating because I think that this idea wasn't horrible, it just needed more emphasis. Even after reading Rory's suicide note, which was written entirely in leet speak, I don't feel like I really understand his pain. What if he had been making more posts over the course of the game expressing his darker thoughts? What if there were other posts claiming that there was a way that you could hurt yourself in order to spend time with a dead loved one? I just think that this could have been better foreshadowed. The other problem is that I don't think most people who play games are going to go out of their way to slight Rory. If this game had a more defined approval system, like Dragon Age Origins for example, then maybe they could have just made Rory start at a very low disposition that could be raised through optional activities. Something for the players to realize what's going on. I will at least say that the scene where Alex discovers Rory's fate is well written and acted. Alex realizes that his selfish internet quest prevented him from realizing what was going on. It feels like an important turning point for Alex. He's realizing that even by being passive and inactive, he can still inadvertently hurt others. And given what he's just learned about the nature of reality, that seems pretty fitting. Now, as we all know, Y2K takes place in the 90s, and there are plenty of various references to that time period, as there probably should be. For me, the only aspect of this that brought back any memories was the game's forum, ONISM 1999. It definitely reminded me of a time when the internet was a lot less friendly and accessible. When I was a kid, I found a lot of strange websites purely through Googling something and going down weird rabbit holes. ONISM feels a lot like one of those sites. Sure, on some level it's just poking fun at paranormal believers and creepypasta, but most of what's written here feels pretty genuine. It doesn't feel like the writers were trying to glamorize the kinds of people who went on sites like this. You might find a few posters who come off like real jackasses. We all know that it's a pretty common sight online. Sometimes you'll see the awkward aftermath of a flame war or somebody getting banned. It's probably a good thing that Alex can't freely make posts on any of these threads. Many of the posts are obviously connected to Sammy Park, and it's interesting to see just how far other people are going when it comes to trying to discover the truth behind that video. Alex's adventures around New Jersey seem pretty tame compared to obsessively calling a missing woman's family over and over again. There's even some very strange posts that come from a user who claims to be Sammy. I know there's no reason to believe this, but some aspects of the post made before her death are oddly foreshadowed at some points in the game. Is Sammy's ghost haunting the forum? I don't know, maybe? From a gameplay perspective though, I do feel that ONISM is a bit underused. There's a handful of side quests that you can take on by reading topics marked with a flame, but the game doesn't really make this clear, and at least one of them is pretty easy to lock yourself out of. And I should mention that you might have a rough time reading ONISM posts if you're playing on console. The font is pretty damn small, and some of the posts can be very long. I'd still recommend trying to read them all, as they do lend a certain atmosphere and dynamic to the events of the game. They're just not something that I would recommend squinting through. So let's get back to the conclusion here. This is where things get weird. We go outside, and all of our friends are waiting for us.
You okay, dude? You look terrible.
Yeah, maybe you should sit in the backseat.
It's time to head into the big city to watch the New Year's ball drop. This is fine. Everything looks totally normal. Reality has almost completely broken down now. The Essentia explains that this is happening in part to force all of the party members to meet Alex, as they're important people to him in every reality. But now things have deteriorated so much that they aren't even aware that the world is ending anymore. Everyone heads to Times Square to watch the ball drop. That's when a comet with Alex's face appears. So it's time to fight Lavos.
LP toss!
Even this boss was taken out in one hit from LP toss. Except this just exposes that he can't actually be killed. The comet will just delete our friends from existence until it's only Alex left. The world has been destroyed, but Alex still has Panda and his otherworldly possessions to keep him company. He does the one thing that would have saved his life to begin with, escaping the soul space. After floating around for a while, Alex finds Panda out there with him.
What the hell am I gonna do out here all alone?
Alex, I don't have any answers for you. I'm sorry.
You mean you don't have answers? You always have something to say.
Alex, how am I supposed to know what to do?
I'm only a stuffed panda.
Hey, you come back! I don't care if you're a toy! I need you!
He eventually comes across a floating island where Alexes from other realities now reside. They all escaped with Essentia when she came to get them. one of the Alexes looks identical to Claudio and Chandra's brother. Alex heads to the other side of the island where he finds more hooded parallel Alexes preparing to destroy more realities. He tries to follow them and stop them, but he fails over and over again, barely remembering his friends or the events that led up to all of this. Eventually he finds a reality that hasn't been targeted yet. There he asks us for help. That's right, we're Alex from another reality, and he's been monologuing to us this whole time.
Will you help me defeat parallel versions of ourselves? I understand that in your reality, you interface with the soul space via a gaming device. Man, wish I had one of those.
All of those names that you input at the start of the game should appear here as though you were naming yourself and all of the party members of your reality. If you selected the female option at the beginning, your Alex would appear as one. I had planned to give them all funny names, but the game glitched out, so you can't really see them. With a whole new party, you head inside of the Proto-Alex Comet, where the game goes full Gygus. We fight 4 twisted versions of Alex: Masturbating Alex, Consumer Alex, Sloth Alex, and my favorite, Pretentious Alex.
The truth is, I'm not original. Everything I have to say that you found interesting has been said before.
All of these guys go down in one LP toss, so it's a good thing that we now have 2 Alexes in case we miss. After opening the maw of Alex, the specter of Sammy appears and apologizes. She implies that someone has been using her pain and suffering to motivate you. Then we enter a strange chamber. Proto-Alex sits on a throne alongside the Essentia 995, who begs us to kill him. Proto-Alex doesn't really seem to care about any of this, but he knows why we're here. In fact, he tells us not to bother killing him, because Essentia has been lying and manipulating us the whole time to get to this point, and the Essentia does not deny this.
Yeah, look, I'll make this simple for you. I'm you, you're me, she's us. The division of our soul isn't exactly natural, and she wants out. She wants to be the last one here. She just can't accept our little arrangement. I get it, but we've been this way for a long time, man.
We have no choice but to fight the both of them as a twisted pair. Guess what? LP toss ends this fight instantly. Guess what else? You're meant to lose here too. Dying here sends us to the afterlife, the one featured in Two Brothers. Roy, the main character from Two Brothers, gives us a really ill-fitting pep talk to try to motivate us to basically be better than his game was. I have issues with this, but I don't want to get sidetracked. We're basically stuck in this chamber now. You can try and fight Proto-Alex as many times as you want, but you'll never beat him. What you're supposed to do is talk to your Alex, and then head for the switches on both sides of the duo. Flipping these switches will apparently cause Proto-Alex and Essentia to merge and die. It's a little spotty what happens next, but I think that all of the different realities are being merged into one and effectively reset, possibly allowing your Alex to live on in another reality. Alex gives us a brief send-off before the credits roll.
I'm so worried about hurting my friends. I didn't realize the difference between being flawed and being... Anyway, it doesn't matter now. Look out for us. Look out for me. Take it easy.
So, yeah. This ending throws a lot of stuff at you pretty fast. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people came away from it very confused or disappointed. You spend a lot of time grinding for a final boss battle that never happens. There's no great big final dungeon either. If the 4 Alexes weren't there to LP toss into oblivion, this ending would be entirely cutscenes. That said, I don't think that the story twists here are as random and nonsensical as some people have claimed, so I'm going to try my best to explain what I think everything that's happened over the course of the game was, with the context of how it ends. Very important, the following here is my interpretation of the literal events of the game. While I don't think that there's one true answer to everything that happens, we will discuss the game's thematic meanings later, which I think have a much clearer intention. So again, these are just my thoughts. I could be totally wrong about this, but here we go. In another reality, the Japanese soldier Yuzu Imajo was working to create the Essentia 995. He recounts that humans were used as test subjects for this process, so it's possible that his mother was one of them, or that the Essentia's physical appearance was modeled after her for some reason. The Alex of that reality stole the Essentia and merged his soul with hers. This appears to have granted him a form of trans-dimensional immortality. He maintains a physical body and travels across realities, causing them to deteriorate and eventually be destroyed. The Essentia, while connected to Proto-Alex, can still maintain control over her form in each reality. She convinces the Alex of each reality to enter soul space, where they eventually merge with Proto-Alex. But by the time that the events of the game play out, Essentia no longer wants to be connected to Proto-Alex, or maybe she never wanted that at all. So now she seeks to find an Alex who's strong enough to defeat him, though there's nothing to suggest that she wants him gone just out of the goodness of her heart. Without Proto-Alex, Essentia would likely maintain her own control over soul space. The Alexes encountered on the island were likely not regarded as being strong enough to take on Proto-Alex, so they were abandoned there. Eventually, she began to reach out to the Alex that we follow during the events of the game. This Alex's reality was deteriorating before he ever got back home from college. And this is more than likely responsible for many of the strange things that happen in the world, such as the factory hotel, or the presence of monsters. While not all of the distortions are happening for a clear-cut reason, I believe that some of them are. All of Alex's allies in the game are said to have been important people to him in the original reality. I wouldn't be surprised if some of them tried to stop him and failed. Because of this, their souls are drawn to him in an attempt to stop him from continuing to end realities. Reality is being distorted maliciously to prevent them from doing so, though it's not entirely successful. If the soul of a party member is not present in this reality, then one is moved from another in an attempt to replace it. Michael is the game's clearest example of reality shifting around Alex's friends. Alex hasn't seen Michael since the early 90s, but he can't seem to remember that fact when he runs into him in Frankton, apparently having never moved away at all. It's not entirely clear what happened to the Michael of this reality. Alex finally remembers attempting to meet up with him sometime after he moved, but Michael flaked on him. I assume that he had already left or had been made to leave this reality by then, eventually being replaced by the Michael that joins the party. Distortions pertaining to Michael continue to happen throughout the game. The location of his house changes. Some of the strange phone calls sound like they could be coming from him. Even after spending time in his mind dungeon understanding all of his personal lives, he can't fully process what's been happening. He knows that things are different, but he can't convince others to see it. Vella Wild is difficult to pin down. She believes that she's from another reality, and the record gives us physical evidence of that. But I question whether or not Essentia's claims about Vella are lies or not. Essentia claims that Vella and Sammy are both her parallel lives. Despite spending time in the mind dungeons of both Essentia and Vella, we don't really see anything that connects them together. In Vella's mind dungeon, there are some hooded Alexes standing around a bed like in the dreams about the Essentia, but if we look closely, there is no one laying in it. We do see Sammy elsewhere in this dungeon, so it's possible that they're parallel lives of each other, but Essentia may just be using Alex's fascination with both of them to make herself more appealing to him. This is a little spotty though. If Sammy and Vella are the same soul, then how could they exist in the main reality together? If Sammy really was partially in soul space for some time, then that might explain how Vella was also able to exist in the same reality for so long. It's kind of a stretch, but it's something. Rory is a little different. He was born of this reality, but the tragedies that strike him and his sister may be distortions attempting to force him away from Alex. His depression and potential suicide are engineered to prevent him from helping Alex. Perhaps the most interesting aspect is how Alex's own family has been torn apart. His father is simply gone. His mother is also becoming similarly absent despite spending much of the game unemployed. Alex very rarely mentions having a sister, but can't seem to bring up many details about her. But when we inspect the table in the Eagleston house, we can see that it's set for 5. So who's missing? To understand this, we need to talk about Claudio and Chandra. Their brother Aaron went missing in the 80s and can be seen at the shelter of the surviving Alexes in Soul Space. This means that Claudio and Chandra are Alex's siblings from another reality. Unlike Vella, they aren't aware that they've come here, though they do mention having dreams that would corroborate this theory.
You know, I had a dream last night. In my dream, I saw my brother, but my brother was you.
The siblings of Alex in this reality have been out of the picture for a long time. There's almost no evidence of them other than this table. It doesn't even seem like there's enough room for them all in the house itself. ONISM itself might be serving as some sort of interdimensional conduit. Michael claims that his partner who helped set up the site was really just himself from another reality. Another poster specifically mentions one of the Essentia's identities. There's one who wrote many strange posts that line up with aspects of Sammy later claiming to be her long after her death. However, this is just us talking about the literal events here. Y2K, being a postmodern RPG, is clearly metaphorical at times, and we'll save those interpretations for a later section. For now, let's talk about the game's other ending. Y2K has another ending that you can work towards as soon as it becomes New Year's Eve. The first step involves logging on to ONISM and reading a long post that may or may not be written by the game's developers. It tells Alex that there was a better ending for him, one that didn't result in the world being destroyed. If he wants to find it, he needs to ignore Essentia's lies, believe in himself, and remember what he's really been trying to do this whole time. When you go outside, don't meet up with your friends. Instead, look behind the tree and, oh, it's Sammy. I guess this is where she was the whole time. She tells Alex that it's his turn to hide, and also that she loves him. If he heads back inside and goes through the backyard, we'll be in a glitched out world map. The only place that we can go is to Sammy's workplace, the Korean News Network building. Just to clarify, you could always come here, and it did always look this strange. You just couldn't get inside. Once in the building, we start doing intern duties for the boss man, who refers to us by our real name. If Rory died during your playthrough, he'll appear in the closet where he says that even though you were a dick, your actions didn't lead to his death, and that you should just consider being a better person the next time that you have a friend in need. Eventually, we can go to the upper floor where several NPCs talk about how they're content that was cut from the game, even implying that this is a happy ending that the publisher wouldn't let Ackk Studios use. After that, we end up back in the hotel from the start of the game. Sammy explains that the Essentia did not share her soul and was only using her to further her own agenda. Sammy wants the player to enter soul space with her. She claims that it's the only way to prevent this reality from being destroyed, even if Alex must leave his family and friends behind. After entering the elevator, Sammy hugs the player and says that she's glad to have met them, even if it was just in a game. So yeah, this is no less confusing. I'm not really sure how much of it was even intended to make sense, especially if it was quickly slapped together like the various fourth wall breaks and the complete lack of voice acting imply. The best way to look at this ending is to turn it upside down. It's not some kind of happy, better ending, it's worse in literally every regard. Alex continues to chase Sammy rather than accepting any of his responsibilities or changing as a person. His obsession with her death has taken over completely. How can his absence from this reality really stop it from being destroyed? The Proto-Comet didn't seem to care about whether or not he was present. The talk of discovering the truth or returning to reality is just an excuse. Alex's final acts before the world is destroyed are selfish and delusional. As he sinks into the fantasy of who he wanted Sammy Park to be, the game even makes the claim that you might be sharing in this delusion. I think that if this ending had a little more substance to it, I might view it as being more interesting than it is. But because it feels vague and half-baked, I can't say that I really like it at all. An ending like this should have been more of a trap that the player could easily fall into, rather than something that you're probably not going to discover without looking it up. There is, of course, much more to say about the character of Sammy and how she's intended to be viewed, but we will save that for later, because we have to talk about the other endings. Yes, Y2K sort of has 2 additional endings, but these are not intended to be accessible. To understand them, we have to talk about Ackk Studios some more. More specifically, we have to discuss the family tragedy that played a significant role in the game's extended development. Y2K started development in early 2014, with the Allanson brothers booking a booth at PAX East first, and then racing to complete a build for the show floor. This move paid off, as by the end of the year, they had received a publishing deal with Yeastbreed, but this good news was undercut by the fact that their mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The pair decided to rent an office just 10 minutes away from her, so they could be close enough to take care of her as her condition worsened. Ackk had planned to release Y2K by the end of 2016, just a few months after the release of the Episode Prime demo. But after returning from PAX West, Their mother's condition deteriorated significantly. There was no way that the brothers could prepare to ship the game with all of this happening, so they announced that the game would be delayed indefinitely. By the end of the year, she passed away at age 50. After taking time off, the brothers decided to change various aspects of the game that no longer seemed up to par. They estimate that about 25% of the game was altered. This includes completely redesigning the Essentia dungeon to make it much more horrific in appearance, as well as totally rewriting the game's ending. This might explain why almost all of the finale's voice-acted characters are just different incarnations of Alex, as well as why Sammy and Essentia are suddenly played by different actresses. While it's true that the rest of the party does have a bit of dialogue, it's not very specific, and it could have been reused from an earlier version, where the twist involving your Alex and his party was still being used. It might also explain why Proto-Alex and Essentia 995 reused the faces of two unique NPCs from the Cape Juno demo. There's also this tower on the overworld that looks quite imposing but can't be reached ever. I'm not sure why this was kept if it serves no purpose, but I guess it's quirky. So the endings that we're going to discuss next shouldn't be considered canon, but they're a piece of the overall puzzle. Why? Because one of them was basically thought to be some kind of puzzle in and of itself. If you hop around the Steam page and a few other places, you'll see that people were under the impression that this game had a secret third ending. This was allegedly even teased by the developers somewhere in the game's Discord server. Much of the theory revolves around this locked combination chest that you can find early on in Sammy's chamber. There's no other chest like this in the game, and the combination doesn't exist. Even if it did, it wouldn't matter. You can't return to this room after finishing this dungeon, and even the version of it that appears in the pink ending does not contain the chest. It's a fluke, a red herring, or just something that was cut. Data miners have looked around, and there's nothing more to this. There's no secret third ending. Except, several months after the game came out, a YouTube account that had only 3 videos uploaded footage of this ending. Things start out normal. He finds Sammy and leaves the house, but then he clips through the water to get to the tower. This leads to an area that was probably meant to be in the final dungeon before everything was changed. There's an imposing figure standing in the distance, but when we reach him, the game abruptly cuts. Now we're in a different Frankton. It's actually an earlier version of the town that went unused, but I think here it's supposed to represent what Frankton looks like for your Alex. Essentia is hanging out with Wilfred from Cape Juno, and it appears that they're both plotting to find more Alexes. Alex follows both of them back to the final boss room and gets into a fight with them. After winning against them, he explains how Essentia was using him to his friends, as well as the fact that he'd been fighting against the pair with your Alex for a long time. Instead of Roy from Two Brothers bringing you back to life, your Alex just sent everyone back to the beta era far enough before the end of the world so that they could be stopped. I guess. There's zero voice acting in here, too. Everyone goes back home to the beginning of the game and lives happily ever after, with Alex monologuing about how he'll make the right choices from here on out. I mean, maybe this is an extremely unfinished ending that the game might have had, but why did they just upload this to the internet? It's not in the game files. The brothers made this just for the video, maybe. I'm not even sure if this is a joke or not, but it kind of feels that way to me. It's not very productive to keep talking about this since it's probably never going to be fully explained to my satisfaction, so let's just move on with the final ending. If you dig around in the game's files, you won't find the alleged secret third ending, but you will find bits of what the ending might have been before Ackk decided to significantly change everything. There is voice acting here, so this is confirmed 100% real stuff. I can't say that I know for certain what this ending was, but I can guess based on the behind-the-scenes footage that I've seen. I think that much of the original ending will play out as normal. Alex's reality is destroyed, and he travels to the island of other Alexes. Then he finds the player and gets their help. This is where things diverge. We still have this new dungeon that was never used, but it looks like you were meant to play as Essentia during this part. When she gets to the top, she fights the original version of Proto-Alex herself. After this fight, both Alexes show up to help her. It seems like the biggest difference is that Essentia doesn't suddenly become a villain. There's no mention of her lying to Alex at all. She's capable of fighting Proto-Alex herself and seems to express regret at getting other Alexes killed over and over trying to stop him. It's a shame that we didn't have this boss or this dungeon. This is exactly the kind of content that was missing from the finale that they went with. This version of Proto-Alex even seems to have a unique attack that hits the whole party, but only takes one QTE to dodge. So after winning this fight legitimately, Alex decides to find a reality that he doesn't exist in so that he can reunite with his friends and help them. But before that, he thanks the player for being the better person.
I want to thank you. You're truly awesome. You're the me I wish I could have been. You picked up the fight without having to be asked. You knew the right thing to do without needing an angelic android or whatever to come save you. You didn't need your reality to be destroyed to understand that things were getting bad. I guess you have the foresight I lacked.
I don't understand why this was cut when it feels more optimistic and definitively conclusive. Granted, I don't have all the parts, so I could be totally misinterpreting this. Maybe they just wanted to create a twist involving the Essentia betraying you, so this didn't work anymore? I suppose it doesn't really matter. The Allanson brothers are allowed to use whatever ending that they wanted, and I can't say for sure that this would have been better to go with. But I think that highlighting this shows you just how much games can change over the course of development, as well as some of the unexpected reasons why they change. If you've made it this far, then congratulations. Please, go take a break, because everything we just did, that was the easy part. If you're sitting here wondering why I said that this game is controversial, then you're going to want to stick around. We will be covering multiple claims made against this game and its developers, some of which received media attention, and others which you might basically find as hearsay if you spend time looking at online message boards and social media. We will also be taking a good, hard look at the themes and central characters of Y2K, because, with all due respect, I believe that many of the criticisms levied against them hold less weight when you've actually experienced the entirety of this game. As always, much of what you'll see here are my own opinions. If you disagree with my points, that's just fine. But remember that I've already spent a while talking about what I didn't like with this game. I have nothing to gain by white knighting. With that said, let's start things off with a very serious claim. Y2K plagiarized. Around late May 2019, an image started to spread showing similarities between an NPC's dialogue in Y2K and the writings of Haruki Murakami. Murakami is considered to be one of the great postmodern authors of our time, so some people are going to be familiar enough with his work to spot it being copied and pasted in an indie RPG. Ackk Studios released a statement in response to the accusations, stating that the use of passages from the book After Dark was an intentional homage. This happens when Alex goes to the factory hotel and enters a supernatural environment for the first time. The narration that happens during some of Alex's early game dreams is also purportedly taken from Murakami's works as well. I'm not that familiar with Murakami, but I have read books by some of the other authors Ackk Studios has cited as inspirations. If this proto-woman started speaking passages from one of those books, I probably would have assumed that it was meant to be an homage of sorts. Could more have been done to make that clear? Certainly. But Y2K is far from the first piece of media to quote another work without providing a formal citation for credit. And since there don't seem to be any other known liftings of work by this author or any others, it certainly feels like claiming that this game stole isn't really fair. There are a few other claims of plagiarism that I've observed, all of which come from some common English dictionaries. These all appear when someone's explaining something scientific, or at least pseudoscientific. It seems rather than writing their own exposition, direct quotes from Google were used instead. This is pretty bizarre stuff, and there might be some truth to it. These lines do tend to sound very dry, like they were the first draft of dialogue that was never polished, but it's important to note that if you credit your sources, then directly quoting them is not plagiarism. Remember that list of inspirational properties I mentioned? It also directly states that these excerpts were used in the game. This menu was actually added to the game in a patch, specifically to dispel any notion of plagiarism. But it's funny because even though I've seen many discussions of plagiarism taking place after this patch, people seem to be genuinely unaware of this menu, and it's likely because I could only access it in the PC port for some reason. The use of references to books by Murakami and others is not very different from the lifting of gameplay from various other video games, yet no one complains about that, despite the fact that the average gamer is far more likely to recognize when gameplay from an old Nintendo game is being reused. Perhaps this is because we find it easier to protect written word than gameplay concepts, but far bigger wars have been waged over far more dubious claims on infringement. Perhaps most importantly, Y2K never changed any of this allegedly infringing material, and there's no evidence that Murakami has taken issue with the use of his work. And if the copyright holder doesn't care, then should we? That said, there does appear to be one valid instance of plagiarism in Ackk Studios' history. Their previous game, Two Brothers, apparently took a song from Shadow of the Colossus and bit-crushed it to make it sound like a chiptune track before putting it in the game. This was very difficult to verify outside of a Twitter post because there's virtually no footage of the game online and the Bandcamp page is dead. While I didn't want to accuse whoever made this GIF of fabricating the claim, it does seem very unlikely that Ackk would do this, given that Andrew Allanson and his collaborators are more than capable of composing entire soundtracks. But after some sleuthing, I was able to find some raw footage that confirms this, in my eyes at least. It's not an homage, it's not sampling or anything like that. It's just taking the raw MP3 file of the Shadow of the Colossus song and then running it through Audacity until it sounds really compressed. I could do that. So yes, this is one instance where I think the term plagiarism could be used unambiguously. I'd be curious to see if other songs from Two Brothers were identified as well, but I can at least find some relief in knowing that the music of Y2K did not appear to follow this trend. I've yet to see any reports of musical plagiarism surface with that, and I doubt that I will. So let's move on to the next notable allegation. This is the one that really grabbed me when the game first came out, as someone had included a mention of this on the game's Wikipedia page. Y2K took a real-life, unsolved death and romanticized the victim. Elisa Lam was a Chinese-Canadian student who traveled to the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles, where she spent several days alone. After failing to check out of the hotel or contact her family, she was reported missing to the police. After 2 weeks of searching the hotel and the surrounding area, the LAPD decided to post security footage of the last time and place that Lam was seen on the internet. This footage comes from an elevator in the hotel. Lam can be seen acting erratically, hitting multiple buttons, sticking her head out and looking around the hall, even appearing to hide before standing outside and gesturing oddly before walking away. 4 days after this video was posted, the body of Elisa Lam was found stripped naked alongside her clothes and belongings inside of the water tank on top of the building. The autopsy ruled the cause of death to be an accidental drowning brought on by a psychotic episode. The unsettling nature of her death, along with the elevator footage, caused the incident to go viral, especially on Chinese social media sites. People pored over everything they could to try and figure out what they believed had really happened. Was she on drugs? Was this really an accident? Was someone chasing her? Was the footage being edited to trick us? Were the police in on it? Is it just a coincidence that her Tumblr was updated after her death and her phone was never found? How could she have gotten into the water tank in the first place? Maybe something supernatural is involved. None of this matters, in my opinion. I didn't know Elisa Lam. She died in the hotel painfully. Her family will never have answers. It's a tragic event. And if someone really would capitalize on it for the sake of a quick buck, I wouldn't think too highly of them. And it's happened more than you think. The Wikipedia page for Elisa Lam has a very long section about instances where her death has been referenced in popular culture. It's been used for crime dramas, it's been used for cheapo horror movies, and there have been numerous songs about her death. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that Y2K is not unique in its use of this case as a basis for some kind of mystery. Real-life headlines are constantly used as the basis for fiction, but the real question is whether Y2K pulled that off effectively. Elisa Lam passed away in early 2013, so the case could have been on the developers' minds during the inception of the project. In an early interview about the game, Andrew Allanson specifically cites the case as a point of influence, mostly discussing how he felt that the superstition associated with the case overshadowed the fact that someone had actually died. At a glance, Y2K's use of this real-life tragedy seems extremely tasteless. The elevator video is turned into her cause of death in a hotel while still being sensationalized on the internet. Alex is obsessed with her despite only knowing her for a few minutes. His driving motivation is to find this woman. It's the Dulcinea effect in full bloom. But this is only how it looks at first glance. So onlookers and people who gave up on the game after a few hours didn't check to see if Alex's behavior is ever questioned. We'll talk about Alex in more detail soon, but for those who need a reminder, he begins the game at a major life crossroads. He's just finished college and returns to his hometown. It's time for him to become a responsible, functional adult. Sure, it's normal for him to be pretty freaked out about seeing Sammy die like that, but I'd say that after he's posted his evidence on ONISM, there's little more that he can do about the situation. Everything after that is him hyper-fixating on Sammy when he should really be concerned about the course of his own life. Alex should be trying to help his mom by getting a job. He should be trying to make friends, not recruiting party members for some quest. He should be trying to understand and help those friends when they're going through their own struggles. But he doesn't because he thinks that finding some woman he didn't know will fix the problems he's avoiding. We never really get to know who Sammy Park is. There are little snippets of the real woman mentioned in some scenes and on ONISM. Many of these details betray Alex's memory of her, because he was so wrapped up in meeting her that he didn't quite realize how crazy she was acting. This all reads like an outright criticism of the people who spent who knows how long on their computers attempting to solve the case of Elisa Lam. These people are trying to make themselves the hero of a story that doesn't concern them. They're trying to solve a mystery that might not even exist. It's not good behavior, and Alex is wrong for engaging in it. The clear counter to this argument is that if Alex didn't follow the Sammy mystery, then none of the events of the game would have happened. So in a way, Alex is rewarded for pursuing Sammy in the end because he's able to save the multiverse. That said, many stories begin with the main character following a fool's errand before eventually realizing that there was a higher purpose. Not to mention that even if Alex never followed Sammy's cat into the hotel, he still probably would have learned about ONISM from Michael the next day. And since the Essentia's soul had been living in Alex's house since he first arrived in town, he probably would have gone on the quest to find the record that caused her to awaken anyways. Either way, I'm willing to accept that this aspect of the story isn't handled as clearly as it could have been. Should the developers of the game have done more to distinguish Sammy Park from Elisa Lam? Probably. In earlier demos, she was living in a surreal factory rather than a hotel, but they decided to change this later. It's very odd because many of the references to content in the old factory stage remain in the final game. But either way, the hotel even has a water tower on top. There's even a direct reference to Lam's death much later in the game. Ultimately, I'm not too sure if changing the superficial details about Sammy would have really done that much to change this. The character was always meant to be a reference to this case, and always will be one. While Alex may practically lust after a dead stranger, I don't believe that the developers share that opinion. When I first saw the comparisons, I was definitely shocked and a little disgusted, but it's clear to me now that they were trying to shine a light on these sorts of post-mortem parasocial relationships. And I think that it feeds into other aspects of Alex's character that are meant to be analyzed critically. You can't get very far when talking about Y2K without someone bringing up how much Alex sucks. Virtually every review will mention his long monologues and selfish attitude. I'll agree that he doesn't set the best first impression, but so many characters in the game are outwardly critical of him, and pretty early on too. So why do so many accounts of the game act like this behavior isn't called out? The simple answer to this is that these people didn't complete the entire game and jump to unfair conclusions. While I did find at least one professional review that admits to this, I don't mean to make a blanket statement about all of them. But when it comes to overall players of the game, there's absolutely some metrics to support this when we look at achievement percentages. And really, that's not that all surprising. Lots of people buy games and then don't get very far in them, especially when they're on the cheaper side. But there's a difference between saying, I tried that game and I just wasn't feeling it, and saying, yeah, I played a game and the main character sucked. One implies that you've got the knowledge to make such a claim. Although they are not always the end-all be-all, first impressions are very important, especially when it comes to introducing your main character. This is perhaps the key reason why so many people don't like Alex, because the opening moments of Y2K do a poor job at making him a character who you want to follow for the length of an entire RPG. Between the monologue when he finds Sammy's cat, and his overly verbose depiction of entering an elevator, not to mention the awkward jokes about porn right before he finds the video footage of Sammy, I think most people just want Alex to shut up, or at the very least, they want the game to have an auto-advancing dialogue system. Pressing a button for every single line in the game really wore on me. I wouldn't be surprised if Alex was written here to be intentionally annoying. He comes off as very selfish and unsympathetic. Rather than really listening to anything that Sammy is saying, he seems trapped in his own thoughts and speculation about the situation. And yes, it's very possible that meeting a mysterious, attractive woman is why he's willing to overlook the fact that she's spouting nonsense half the time. At this point in the story, Alex has only just left college. Things aren't as simple as they used to be. He'll have to make all sorts of decisions now that he likely wasn't prepared for. As the game often likes to point out, he didn't major in something all that specific or useful, and once his mother is laid off, he won't even be able to acclimatize to normal life at his own pace. So when he encounters Sammy, ONISM, and the mysteries associated with them, he finds his excuse to avoid making that transition. Much of this game's story concerns Alex struggling to cope with adulthood. His attempts aren't very successful and come at the cost of straining his friendships. It's a good thing, then, that the friends he enlists on his journey are also at their own crossroads of sorts. Michael has his own stresses about going from high school to college. Vella's an extra-dimensional immigrant who's basically hit a dead end. Claudio can't get past his brother's disappearance, and it seems like Chandra is motivated to stick around him just to make sure that Alex doesn't make things worse for him. And then there's Rory. It's obvious that he's going through serious depression throughout the game's events. In many ways, he could be seen as a parallel version of Alex. Not another Alex from another dimension, we're not getting into that right now. Rory clearly comes from a lower economic status than Alex. Unlike him or Michael, college isn't in his future. He doesn't seem to have any friends now that his sister is gone. Even sadder is the fact that if Alex can sometimes be an ass to him, he's providing Rory with the only thing close to a distraction from the sadness of his life. As horrible as it sounds, sometimes being around people who are bad for you is better than being alone. Alex can at least try to become a better listener to Rory and offer what support he can. Even if he fails to do this, he's still keenly aware of his failures.
Why did I continue to convince myself that nothing was ever my fault? Sometimes things are your fault. And sometimes you're supposed to feel bad, supposed to feel low, supposed to feel like you let the world down. You!
It's a moment of clarity that comes quite late in the story for Alex, and also fits in with much of the game's narrative up to this point. Alex is a supreme sloth. The more he ignores his responsibilities, the more he brings harm to the people around him. Of course, he has many excuses to justify his continued behavior. This is where we center back to his revelation in the Mind Dungeon. Alex being the center of the universe is in no way an attempt to vindicate his behavior. It's the polar opposite. By being at the center, he never has to change, never has to adapt. His unfiltered behavior can continue as is, with no fear of the consequences that it holds, even if his behavior will only lead to absolute destruction of the things he cares about. It's pure existential denial. The tragedy with Alex is that he doesn't fully realize this until it's too late. Everything is gone by the time that he can become as close to being truly selfless as he can. But by this point in the story, he's interacting with our Alex, a person who might have lived a life similarly to Alex in some ways, or perhaps not at all. But by the end, the message is clear to me. Do not repeat the mistakes that Alex made. Learn from them. From a narrative view, it's not bad that Alex is bad sometimes. Y2K is a story. The conflict and the drama needs to come from somewhere. In this case, it's just as internal as it is external. In reality, you'd probably fairly tired of Alex after a week of hanging out with him, but nobody who's played Y2K has to do that. We only spend a few hours pretending to be with him. And yet people seem more disgusted by Alex than they would be a character who's committed crimes. This is something that's puzzled me for a while. Is there something about this character that hits too close to home for people? This is a game starring a cast of millennials, made by millennials, and meant to be played by millennials. so I doubt that it's a surprise that he embodies some negative traits associated with his generation. But the idea that he's meant to be a straw man doesn't quite gel with me, because none of the other cast members come off that way. There's absolutely a part of me that wonders if the response to Alex would have been different had he not looked so normal. He pretty much looks like the default 20-something gamer guy. He reminds me of untold numbers of people that I've seen at college, game stores, conventions, or as the ID photos on review sites. It really makes me wonder, what would people think of Alex if he was essentially the same character, but he just looked different? Would people still react strongly to him if he looked like some sort of cute animal person, or an anime girl? I don't think so, but I'll leave that one up to you to decide. Across 3 different platforms, the Metacritic score of Y2K averages out to 60 out of 100. But that's not out of a terribly large selection of reviews. Obviously, indie games aren't going to draw as much attention as something from a more established publisher. In fact, many of the sites that reviewed the game are just as obscure to me as I think this game is to most people. As much as some people like dunking on professional reviews, that's not something that I'm interested in doing here. Reviews from the media are no more or less subjective than reviews by consumers, despite what some people think. Maybe there are more expectations from a professional, but the end goal is the same. Is Y2K a good product? Well, when it comes to many key areas, I think I've made it clear that the game stumbles. So I have little reason to disagree with reviews that ultimately come to the same conclusion. Besides, I don't think that reviews really had much to do with Y2K's reputation. For myself, reading them was an entry point to the game, but it wasn't until I started hearing details from others that I became much more curious about it. And those sources come from websites that are much less professional. On Steam, we can see Y2K has a mixed score out of about 100 reviews. On Metacritic, we can see the user reviews for the PC are a 2.6 out of 10 from only 22 ratings, whereas the Switch reviews are 5 out of 10 from 34 ratings. As I mentioned way back at the start of this video, it was the extremely hyperbolic nature of people's reactions to Y2K that caused it to catch my eye. Aside from more grounded complaints concerning problems with combat, dialogue, and glitches, it's hard to recall the last time I saw a game receive this many harsh accusations regarding its content. It's these accusations that ultimately caused me to play the game, and at the end of the day, I can't help but feel like I fell for some kind of trap. Originally, I wanted to make a detailed list of the claims that I saw and try to ascertain their accuracy, but it just became too depressing of a prospect. If you go to places like Reset Era or Waypoint, you'll find the kinds of things I saw all over social media around release time. There's simply too much to reasonably go through. Claims of fat-shaming, racism, endorsing domestic abuse, homophobia, transphobia, claims of alt-right dog whistling, and even endorsing pedophilia? Now, if any of these things had actually happened, I'd absolutely point them out, but in my opinion, they didn't. Many of these allegations can be explained by either an extreme misrepresentation of the game's story and themes, or from people viewing screenshots of clips of the game without having accurate context. Let's go over some of those briefly. Alex in Vella's universe is a creep who emotionally manipulated and abused her. The playable Alex can also pursue romantic interactions with her. Some people think that this approves the abuse she suffered. But why? The Alex in Vella's universe is an entirely different character. The primary Alex in no way endorses what happened to her. He's actually disgusted that any version of himself could do those things. Given the fact that the game is about Alex realizing that he will become a destructive force to others if he doesn't change, I just don't understand this complaint. That said, I believe that some of the discomfort surrounding domestic abuse in Y2K stems from the fact that Alex's voice actor has admitted to emotionally abusing many of his partners, friends, and family. He has also been accused of other forms of abuse, which he denies. I absolutely don't support that sort of behavior, but I also don't think that it can be used against Y2K. Chris Niosi did not create the game. He was simply cast as Alex and recorded the vast majority of his lines as early as November 2014. The public apologies for his behavior occurred in July 2019, well after the game's release. although it's true that some call-out posts and rumors about his actions were circulating in the months beforehand. This is why you might see some claims being made around Y2K's release that one of the game's developers is a domestic abuser, which not only isn't true, but it's easily one of the most serious claims being made here. Regardless about how you feel about any of this, I don't believe that it reflects on Ackk Studios in any way. Maybe some of Alex's lines about his fear of hurting women will rub you the wrong way now. That's understandable, but to act like the Allanson brothers were somehow endorsing or complicit in real-life abuse is just plain wrong. Let's move on to another example. In the game's hidden pink ending, the player is made to do intern duties at the Korean News Network building. While there, if we investigate a potted plant, we can find an item called a red pill. This item serves no purpose in the puzzles here, nor can it be consumed like a health item. This is most likely a reference to the well-known 1990s science fiction classic, Total Recall. In this film, Douglas Quaid is told that most of the events of the film up to this point have been a dream, and is offered a red pill that is
It's a symbol of your desire to return to reality.
He seriously considers taking it, but ultimately realizes that this is a trap and rejects it. Ultimately, it's ambiguous if certain events in Total Recall are really happening or not. There's also a little movie called The Matrix that also has a red pill. Here the red pill is contrasted with a blue one. If Neo takes the red pill, he will also return to reality and leave the simulated matrix that he's lived inside of up to this point. Since then, the red pill has become a bit of a metaphor for becoming aware of unpleasant truths that one was either ignorant of or believed to be concealed from them. Almost like a whole new world's worth of information has been revealed. Fast forward to the middle of the 2010s, and the term getting red-pilled is being used to refer to members of something called the Men's Rights Movement, or MRAs for short. Some elements of this movement refer to themselves as being part of the Men Go Their Own Way movement. This is not a movement that I align with. It is malicious, bigoted, and above all else, illogical. I don't intend to be overly political here, but I take no issue with unequivocally condemning extremism. To them, being red-pilled means concluding that males are inherently superior and that society should be voluntarily or involuntarily segregated by biological sex and sociological gender identity. Suffice to say, this group has been linked to hateful and violent ideologies by journalists and watchdog groups. There's even a documentary about this movement that is called The Red Pill. Since then, the term red pill has been used as something of a counter to being woke. Whereas woke individuals align with the left-wing progressive politics, red-pilled individuals align with the radical far right. Because of this, some people have surmised that the presence of a red pill in Y2K is not a reference to the Matrix or Total Recall, but instead an endorsement of these extreme right-wing groups that have co-opted its symbolism in popular culture to flippantly endorse misogyny. Alex clearly isn't written to be woke. His entitlement is put on blast multiple times throughout the game, but he's definitely not red-pilled either. He's flawed, but not extreme. He's just kind of in the middle, like most people, trying to figure out his way and what he really needs in the world. His perspective has changed as he meets new people and listens to what they have to say, and his ways of thinking are changed because of it. This is a pretty standard arc for a protagonist to go through. In Y2K, the red pill's item description is the literal quote from Total Recall, and much like in that film, the pill is not consumed. Alex stays in a strange world without knowing whether or not it's real. All he knows is that he chose to be there. Given how half-baked this entire ending is, I don't really think that there's all that much to the presence of the red pill, and it certainly doesn't appear to be at all present for the purposes of making a political statement. The best that I can figure is that either Ackk Studios was unaware of the alternate meaning for the term, or they assumed that given the situation that it appears in, along with the direct quote from Total Recall, that it would be recognized solely as a reference. And I have to say, I think that if you made it this far into Y2K, you're going to understand that it's just a reference. But if people were to just screenshot this and post it around the internet, then I really wouldn't fault people for assuming the worst. The majority of the serious accusations tend to get parroted around until the people sharing them might not even be sure of the original claim's details. For instance, someone on Twitter who may or may not have played the game shared a screenshot of a Discord post where someone else claims that there's an NPC in Windtown who implies that he's been lusting after Rory's 12-year-old sister, Carrie. Ackk Studios went out of their way to correct this person's mistake, as the NPC in question is actually talking about Rory's mother, Candy. While her name isn't stated anywhere in the main story, he's obviously talking about Rory's mother, since he calls her Leggy, and she's shown to literally just be a leg. Even if that's not true, it's still obvious that the man is not talking about Carrie at all. This is an outlandish accusation that stems from an honest misunderstanding, and yet I've seen people on the internet double down on this. That's the thing about online criticism. It tends to become a dogpile as more and more people get involved. Let's use Sammy Park as an example. If you're aware of Elisa Lam's story, I can understand being offended at the inclusion of this character, especially if you've only gotten about as far as seeing the recreations of the elevator footage. So maybe this upsets you enough that you'd like to go make a post about it on Twitter or something like that. But then other people see it and start agreeing that this is offensive, spreading the word online even if they have no idea who Sammy Park and Elisa Lam even are. In a circumstance like this, I don't think the majority of people contributing to this are actually offended. It's like they're being offended on behalf of the original poster. Eventually, people will take note of this, assume that the game is implicitly considered bad, and just start dunking on it with all kinds of things, even though they probably weren't playing it at all. Now, this is not to say that you can't be offended by a news story if you're not directly involved. But Y2K is not racial oppression, sexual harassment, terrorism, or any of the other disgusting news stories in the cycle that we're constantly subjecting ourselves to. We're talking about narrative choices in a video game. And even if they're not the most successful choices in the world, they're not worth having a social media meltdown over. If you don't like the content in Y2K, then don't play Y2K. It's not exactly an inescapable mainstream release. Do people just have a problem with the idea of anyone else playing Y2K and enjoying it, as if enjoying it makes you a bigot? I don't believe that should be the case. Part of me feels like people are saying that this game contains everything offensive that it possibly can in some effort to prevent people from playing it at all. Unfortunately, this is a tactic that hasn't really worked throughout history, with everything from Catcher in the Rye to Joker gaining more attention than it likely would have if no one had raised a stink. Now that said, I would prefer to believe that such misinformation about Y2K isn't being spread with a malicious intent. It's easier to accept that it's just ignorance. These people might have just been confused about something they saw in the game, or more likely, they were just reacting to no context images or claims with no corroborating footage at all, resulting in a game of telephone, where the original point becomes so distorted that it's hard to even tell what it was supposed to be. And because of that, it often takes far longer to dismantle a falsehood than it does to lie. I should know, as I've likely contributed to this problem, not necessarily with Y2K, but with many other incidents over the years. I believe that the spread of misinformation is a serious problem in the digital age, but that's something that's well outside the scope of this video. Getting back on track, I don't mean to imply that all of these accusations are completely unfounded. Even though it doesn't appear that any malice was intended, Ackk Studios has responded to fan feedback that revealed some unintended implications. In the game's only patch, they changed some dialogue with the character naming sequence after some transgender players voiced discomfort with being asked, "What was the name that your parents gave you?" This illustrates that while the Allanson brothers did feel pressured to deny many of the claims made against them in their game, they didn't oppose everything. They never tried to claim that the game was above criticism, that there weren't things worth fixing to please people.
I regret not being in the headspace that would be aware that that would be something that would be hurtful to people. It didn't cross my mind when I wrote that, that intro scene 5 years ago. It was something that didn't occur to me, and a few of my friends are transgender and they played the game, and they even said to me afterwards, like, "I'm really sorry that I didn't pick up on that, and that I wasn't able to guide you through it." And I feel upset that if there was someone who played the game and they were hurt by that, when the game is overall supposed to be like a positive thing. We changed that text, and I just wish we thought of it sooner, because if there was one person who played that and was hurt by it, that's the last thing I ever wanted.
The overwhelming counter-argument to any sort of defense of Y2K's content is inevitably the reveal of an interview that the game's writer, Andrew Allanson, gave a few months after the game's release.
Okay.
My mistake was thinking that video games are art. I wanted to make a game about a guy who's like a piece of shit, unlikable character who by the end of the game has to transform.
Yeah.
But too many gamers, when they look at this, when they play a game, they're so used to having to identify with the character that if they play a game where the main character is unlikable or has to do some bad stuff, they immediately get triggered by it. So the thing is, games aren't art. They're toys for children, and it's considered in bad form to talk about anything meaningful or impactful or thought-provoking.
Yeah.
I was trying to make basically the video game version of like a Chuck Palahniuk novel or a Haruki Murakami novel. And,
It's ambitious. Yeah,
to
right.
try and do something a little different, you know? The thing was, like, when you make an unlikable character, people expect Sherlock Holmes or Dr. House. They want flawed heroes, but only to the extent that they're beautiful and intelligent and slightly Aspergery.
Yeah.
But though they manage to be dicks to everyone and they get away with it because they bring some sort of savantism that saves the world.
Yeah.
So if you make a character who's just like some hipster obsessed with the paranormal, who hasn't grown up yet and treats his friends like shit, people immediately feel they don't know how to process this.
Yeah.
But if you put it in a novel, people get it in a novel, but in gamers aren't, you know.
This quote comes from an interview with a podcast called The Dick Show, hosted by comedian and author Dick Masterson. He's probably best known for his 2008 satirical book Men Are Better Than Women, and for his collaboration and eventual falling out with Maddox, creator of the best page in the universe. I'm not really well versed in who this guy is. From a glance, a lot of his stuff looks like edgy shock jock humor that I probably would have been into way back in 7th grade. Whatever the case, Andrew was apparently a fan of his and pitched the interview to him. Much of the interview surrounds how Y2K was being received at the time, but here's what's important to note. Andrew wasn't calling out professional critics, he wasn't arguing that his game didn't have flaws. Much of the irritation is directed towards specific criticisms that were much less valid. The idea that Alex's behavior is endorsed, the idea that the game makes light of Elisa Lam's death, the claims that the game is pro-pedophilia or transphobic, claims that do a lot more damage to his reputation than one might think, and people who have played Y2K to its completion are much less likely to agree with. Now, I don't fully agree with the quote. It's pretty extreme and hyperbolic, but given the stress that Andrew may have been under at the time, I can understand why he'd say something like that. Remember, he's not talking about professional critics. Much of this interview surrounds the outrage on social media and other forums. It's very hard to be polite and respectful towards those who aren't practicing what they preach. Regardless, this quote made the rounds on social media and didn't do much to help the game. More than one think piece was written about it, some harsher than others. Interestingly, Andrew reached out to the author of one of these, and the two had a long conversation that's much more laid back and definitely helps to clarify his stance on the issue.
That, of course, video games are art. There is a subset of people who have yet to realize this, and they would rather have a toy. And those are the people who say, I can't be made uncomfortable by something, I can't have language in a game, I find, disrespectful. Even if it also comes back to this issue where now if a writer writes something, people act as if the writer's condoning it. So then why is it that when people see ONISM and they see people saying rude stuff to each other, we're telling people to go out and act that way on the internet? Why is that the assumption?
I think it's a childish notion. I think either side who would have their way with any medium and try to restrict it into something that they prefer, whether it's one side saying that you're not supposed to depict anything problematic in your story, or another side saying, why do we have to have politics or writing in anything? Why can't it all just be fun machines?
Right.
I think both of them are extremely childish.
Yeah, and ultimately they're both going to hold back the art form of video games. I need to say that by calling something art, I'm not saying that it's good.
I know.
That's a very important thing. I'm not saying that Y2K is a masterpiece, and I'm not saying that I'm a misunderstood genius and any criticism is invalid. I just want people to comment on the content of the game that actually exists.
Of course, the damage was done from the Dick Show appearance. At best, I hope that Andrew learned some lessons about how to handle PR. It just seemed like a very public and ugly lesson to learn. But even this follow-up interview was conducted a long time ago. I was very curious to see if Andrew had given any sort of retrospective about the experience. This led me to the game's Discord server, which quickly led me to Andrew himself. What follows are quotes from our conversation. The release of the game really took us by surprise. We knew Alex would be universally disliked, but that was also the point. We just didn't expect that I would be accused of being Alex, rather than the game being a cautionary tale to not be someone like him. Also, somehow people assumed we thought the game was high art rather than something that was a self-aware melodrama. Somehow I got painted as someone who thinks his game is a masterpiece, and I'm not quite sure where that came from. I only ever thought Y2K was a cool, weird niche project I was making with my siblings and some friends. I always viewed it as an experiment, as we had never made a 3D game or a game for consoles before. So when the narrative became, I was some pretentious artiste, I was really shocked and had no idea how to react to it. When I asked him how early he saw that interpretation surface, he said that it was pretty early on. There was a review that implied it, and a lot of people ran with it. It was the one that called Alex a self-insert. I actually only went on the Dick Show because there was already so much hate for me in the game at that point. I think that a lot of people like to pretend that's when the hate started, because it gives them something to point at and blame, as if it was something I brought on myself. On the Dick Show, I failed to realize how my point could be misconstrued if I didn't have the sentence before. That comment was to show how absurd one specific piece of criticism from a specific tweet that a game must only ever make the player feel joy or fun. People seem to have misunderstood this to mean that because people disliked the game, they didn't want games that were art, when really I was responding to someone who said what a video game had to be. The Dick Show is a comedy podcast where the guest is expected to bring a rage and complain about stuff. I had known the expectations of the guests, so that's why I said what I said on there. I was dumb and thought it'd be understood to be hyperbole because of the context of the show. I was trying to be an interesting guest for what the audience of the show expects, and fucked up not realizing it would probably be brought to an outside audience who didn't get the theme of the show. Obviously, the game is far from perfect. At launch, I didn't think it was a great game. I thought it was an interesting game, and some people would have at least seen that it was trying something above our capabilities and enjoyed it for the oddity it is. Like, I knew the battle mode was far from perfect and was largely underdeveloped and lacking in proper strategy or resource draining. I knew the pacing was wonky because of the sheer amount of narration breaking the flow of the game. I knew the animations weren't great and the game lacked a full cinematic polish to the cutscenes. So I expected those things to be criticized in the reviews, and the other stuff that I thought had charm to come down to the matter of perspective from each individual critic. Andrew also reminded me that he's not the only person who has made a game and then been claimed by detractors to be self-inserted into it. Something very similar happened with Neil Druckmann with The Last of Us 2. There are lots of people claiming that this character is meant to be him, and that they do all sorts of things in the game that they don't actually do. I haven't played that game yet, so I'm not going to comment too much on it, but I did think it was an interesting parallel. He went on to say, "Part of me wonders if people just like having something to hate, and we got chosen to be the thing to hate, and it just grew and grew. Like early on, people were spreading a photo of someone who looked like Alex and claiming it was me. At first I thought it was really funny how people kept insisting I was the character, because Alex was actually based on my bully growing up. A lot of the stuff he says and does is stuff I saw this person do. It felt a bit like my bully having one last laugh against me. But then the hate got darker and more in-depth and more personal, and that's when it got hard. It got upsetting once people said the game promoted being like Alex, and that shocked me, as the game does quite the opposite. Some criticisms I understand, but find a little disappointing. Like, I get emails from people that say, show, don't tell. And yes, the game is exposition heavy, but there is some justification for that. Alex often tells the player stuff that is contrary to what the game is showing. He is unreliable in a lot of ways. Then people assume the game is just failing to take into consideration what the narration is saying, which is the point. You're supposed to ask yourself why there are differences, and then use that to understand the actual meaning. It's a pretty simple device, and I don't think demands too much of the audience. But because many people come at the game hearing how it's bad, It's easy to overlook stuff that may serve a different function than you were told it does. I don't think we pulled this off perfectly, if not everyone would understand this, but it's not like the game is exposition heavy for no reason. I understand that criticism because maybe the average audience may not think to pay attention to those details. Maybe we didn't tip our hand quickly or directly enough that the average player didn't pick up on this. Then I see the audience in the Y2K Discord who understand this right away, and then I don't know what to think about it. When asked if he felt that the game's reputation has improved over almost 2 years since launch, Andrew said, "I'm not entirely sure. I am not very good at getting the big picture of the opinion of the game. I know the fan base has grown. I've seen that in Discord and in fan mail. I know the game has continued to sell despite being almost 2 years old, so that's very murky. Seems to be a mixed bag maybe." Then we started talking more about the negativity surrounding the game, as well as the fact that it comes from certain places that may not be terribly informed about what the game is. Andrew said, "I know 1 or 2 of the people who did reviews didn't actually play it and went off of a Let's Play. And many people use version 1.0 and pretend that there were never any fixes at all, which is always upsetting, probably just because they bootlegged it. YouTuber bought into the hate of the game and gave out a copy on Dropbox or some server as a fuck you to us and the game. That was the stuff that was actually upsetting, not people disliking the game itself, or when people brought my mother's death into it. I saw a lot of people turning that into a joke about Y2K, and that was pretty fucked up. Especially since many of them claim to be game devs themselves. The venom and vitriol that surrounds Y2K Online is honestly quite troubling to me, and is perhaps the entire reason that I played the game to begin with. The way that people spoke of this game led me to believe that it was some sort of terrible, incredibly offensive disaster of an artistic expression. Yet that's not really anywhere close to what happened. It disappointed me in a way. Here's what needs to be said about Y2K in response to all this drama. It's just the average video game. Nothing more, nothing less. It's not some despicable game that peddles racist propaganda. It's not some edgy garbage that desperately wants you to be offended by it. It's not even cheap filler just meant to be dumped on Steam in the hopes that some kid might accidentally buy it, or a cold studio project just meant to suck all your money away. It's just another game made by prospective artists. It pains me to say it, but I suppose I have to remind people that there are plenty of other artists out there who have been accused of far worse things. To associate Ackk Studios with any of these things would be to smother them before they have a chance to grow and mature. The Allanson brothers could create something truly great one day, but I imagine that the way their names have been dragged through the mud would turn anyone off from the idea of making more games. Is Y2K a particularly exceptional game? I'm not so sure, but I still have enormous respect for its creators, because they actually made a game. That's more than I can say I've ever done, and it's probably more than you've accomplished. Creating something like this is an enormous undertaking, especially given how limited their resources were. Many people who've worked in film and games have spoken about how collaborative the process is. Even if a single person gets credit as the director, it doesn't mean that the end result would have been the same if they made everything themselves instead of delegating to others. As humans, we find it easier to ascribe praise and criticism to one person rather than to a collective. Instead of congratulating Konami, we praise Hideo Kojima, even if it's not accurate. With indie games made by smaller teams, it's indeed more accurate to direct feedback towards those individuals. However, just because the end product may be in more direct control by those individuals, doesn't mean that they had any fewer hardships to overcome. I personally tend to be more critical of large budgeted works, because there are so many more people involved in the project. And if there were so many more people involved, it should have been easier for them to identify and correct problems. It's one of the reasons I've been very critical of the works of David Cage and his company Quantic Dreams. Despite budgets in the tens of millions, 2 decades of development experience, roughly 200 employees, and the support of a major publisher, they've made games that try to look like movies despite the fact that they feel like their creators had never even seen or played either. By contrast, it's very easy for a game like Y2K, mostly put together by 2 brothers with far less resources and experience, to have trouble seeing the forest through the trees. That's my philosophy regarding this. Many people champion independent game developers because it's kind of like rooting for an underdog. If they hit it big, it's truly worth commending. But if they don't, then is it really that surprising? In this industry, the odds were against them. but at least they tried, and they're worthy of that baseline respect. Respect that seems to have been ignored. It's time for the million-dollar question. Is Y2K any good? I'm not going to say that I regretted my time with the game. Y2K is somewhat fascinating, both in its content and the conversations that surround it. But I don't really think that I can say that it's outright good. The combat is just absolutely unacceptable. The only way I could put up a real fight against challenging enemies was to break the game. I can't imagine playing without LP toss, it must be horrible. Are there some bright spots elsewhere? Sure, I like the visuals and the music. Really, the whole atmosphere is pretty solid. Y2K rises above some of the very obvious games that inspired it. I can't really say that this game was just a knockoff of something like Earthbound, since it felt so different. It's also quite clear that this game's story is not for everyone. It was designed to challenge your ways of thinking, to make you think about yourself and the people around you, and it does so not by trying to dress itself up as something more fantastic or lighthearted. Some people just don't want that sort of thing. Sometimes I don't want that. But I think that the willingness to handle the subject matter in such a manner makes Y2K a worthwhile project. Ackk Studios had a message that they wanted to put out, and if you can cut through a lot of the noise surrounding this game, you shouldn't have any trouble seeing that message. Maybe you won't agree with it, or think that it was executed flawlessly, but you'll see it nonetheless if you give the game your time. And for me personally, I respect that Ackk tried to tell such a story within the confines of the RPG genre. They didn't just make it some sort of walking simulator or a very linear adventure game when it likely would have been much easier to do so. But here's the other million-dollar question. Is Y2K terrible? I'll be honest, it was quite tempting to say that. The combat is a nightmare. The pacing is not great, there are all sorts of weird hiccups with the game, especially in the first half of it, and of course, the game fails to conclude with a proper final boss despite forcing you to grind for hours. If I stopped playing Y2K just before meeting Rory, then I would probably say that Y2K was one of the worst games I played last decade. Honestly. But as I figured out the various quirks with combat, and the storyline became more focused and interesting, there was never any doubt about me finishing the game, because it became surprisingly engaging. I can at least say that it's not the worst game released in 2019, and there are indie RPGs so weak in their first impressions that I didn't even bother continuing. Years ago, I spent many nights in college with my friends playing and watching very strange, flawed, but entertaining games. Y2K absolutely feels like it would have been one of them. If that sounds like it'd be up your alley, then I would recommend Y2K, but I know that's a pretty narrow group of people. If you're just interested in playing the game for the story and nothing else, then I'm not sure I can sell you on it. Y2K does have an assist mode that gives you infinite time energy, but that's not really enough to get you through some of the most frustrating situations, and using LP toss becomes a brain-dead procedure after a while. Perhaps the biggest shame with Y2K is that the developers didn't stick around to try to fix things. There was one patch that made a few tweaks, but that's it. Were the combat patched so that it functioned properly, I'd happily suggest this game to a larger audience, because it's a pretty strange experience. But unfortunately, it seems like it's destined to remain incomplete forever. Psych! Just when I thought the story was over, it seems like Y2K is getting another shot. New updates are in the works for the game. They'll be addressing combat, bugs, quality of life changes, and even the option to play the game with an edited script that trims down some of the monologues. There are even plans to add a new story character and multiple bosses. While it seems like the story of Y2K might be over for most people, I find it fascinating that the game is getting a second chance. While I highly doubt that every shortcoming can be easily addressed, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious to see what sort of improvements Ackk Studios wants to make. If the new combat system is good, then it could seriously change my opinion on the game. At the very least, it would make it much easier to recommend to people. When these updates come out, and I'm good and ready to revisit Y2K, I'd love to share my thoughts on them. But for now, we'll have to make do with the version of Y2K that was originally released. After all, the purpose of this video was to chronicle its state and reception at launch. I think that the sort of critical thrashing that Y2K received would be enough to turn anybody off of making another game. The fact that the Allanson brothers are interested in revisiting the project fills me with a strange optimism. Perhaps, just like its protagonist, things could only improve after they reached a catastrophic breaking point. That's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. This was really a massive undertaking compared to everything I've done before. I really pushed myself to try something different. 2020 has been a hell of a year. We all know that. The script of this video was something that really kind of lurked just behind my back for most of it, even as all sorts of horrible things were happening. That damn disease that we all know. My mother actually contracted that very early on. My grandmother died from it a few months later, and all these other things happening in my life. I'm starting a new line of work, and all the while the seed of this script and the drafts of it were just there in the background. And I don't think it would have happened if the people who were there for me when we were playing Y2K together back last year, they supported this project, especially all the people who contributed to the proofreading of the script, such as my buddy Scott Uberman, who went very in-depth with it. I also do want to thank Andrew Allanson. I reached out to him very late in the project, and he was very polite, as were the few people that I spoke to briefly in the Y2K Discord. There's a real possibility that Y2K could go on sale when the updates are released, so if you're interested in the game, I would suggest you put it on your wish list. Lastly, I'd like to say, making these videos, it has been a hobby, so I don't really try to advertise or put myself out there, but after doing something this long, I'd really like for it to at least get some traction. I have less than 100 subscribers, I have no ability to monetize anything, so I would love it if this video helped the channel at least reach that threshold. So please consider sharing this video wherever you can, especially if you know anybody who has heard of Y2K or maybe at least heard some of the misinformation that surrounded it. This video is not an attack on those people, but I feel like in a way it's kind of good to get the last word on something like this. And as always, consider subscribing if you're not, leave comments, help this video out, because I really would like to try to do more long-form videos in the future. Maybe not this long, but something more in-depth. Anyways, have a happy holiday season, and here's to a happy new year. And I really do mean that. So thank you so much, and see you next time.